Uh, this is going to be our randomly selected presentation order. You guys are welcome to switch if you talk to other people and they want to present earlier. You're welcome to coordinate. Just let me know. Yeah, otherwise, our presentation order will look like this for next week. Hopefully, the presenters will be here on their days. And the presentations are going to be due at the start of class so that everyone's kind of working from the fair amount of time, equal amount of time. Okay, any questions about this or the presentations next week? Yeah.
I think you said it was 12 minutes per group.
Yeah, 12-ish minutes.
Is that including Q&A?
Well, actually, let's see. We have fewer groups this year, 2 hours. Yeah, we could do longer. We can do like 15 minutes plus time for Q&A. Yeah. Yeah, some years we have like 6, 7, 8 in a day, in a particular day. So we have fewer this year since people grouped up a lot more. So yeah, we can be a little bit more lenient with the time. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming today. We're actually going to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart. So the case studies today, we're going to look at federal policies in energy and transportation. It's mainly when we focus in transportation, we'll do some of the energy stuff at the sort of latter half of the class. But I did a lot of my dissertation work when I was a PhD student in this area. So yeah, we'll talk about context behind a specific set of policies, and then we'll look at some of the like system modeling that folks have done. Okay, so yeah, for those of you who are less familiar with the system of laws in the US, there are actually more than one way in which you can have a rule be implemented in this country. So I think most people are familiar with legislation, and legislation being laws that are passed essentially by Congress, right? And so the way that this happens is that any individual lawmaker, so this could be someone sitting in the House, or this could actually be a senator, they can essentially introduce legislation into the legislature. And what happens, and this is a similar process with what happens at the state level in California, for example, where you have the Assembly and the Senate. A member will introduce a bill. That bill then gets sent to a number of committees that are relevant to the topic of that bill. So if you're doing some kind of like fuel efficiency policy, that might go to the Transportation Committee. That may go through certain like fiscal or financial committees and that sort of thing. And so the committees will weigh in on the bill, and if they pass through the committees, they then get voted in whichever chamber introduced the bill. So if it was a representative in the House, it would go to the House. If it was a senator, then it would go to the Senate. That side votes on it, and then it gets sent to the other side. So if the Senate votes yes, then it has to go to the House. And then there's this whole process, right, with which things might get modified and voted on again, right? But generally speaking, committees and then both chambers vote on it. And once that's approved, it goes to the executive to get to sign. And right, there's a process where the executive can veto it. But most typically, if Congress passes it, then the president would sign it, or if the California legislature passes it, then the governor would sign it in the state of California. So I think that's generally the process that most people are familiar with, right? We know that that's kind of the point of the legislature is to make laws. But actually, there's a separate process known as a regulation, which can pass rules that have the same force of law. Okay, and so who is responsible for producing regulation?
Can you repeat the question?
Who would be responsible? So, like, the legislature or Congress is responsible for passing legislation. Who is responsible for passing regulation? Any idea? Yes. Yeah, I know you guys. Simon's not here today, so you guys are gonna have to raise your hands more. Yeah. So federal agencies, and so actually, why is it that we have federal agencies and like congressmen and congresswomen pass it? Why have both of these? Why not just have Congress do it? Yeah.
Federal agencies have specialized roles, so they have the actual, like, I guess, domain knowledge.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so what does the average senator know about the like frequency bandwidth of like communication channels, right? That like the FCC would be in charge of. They we rely on we rely on the expertise within regulatory agencies to make nuanced laws regarding topics that they have a lot more domain knowledge on. Keep that in mind. That's going to be relevant for some discussion that we may have a little bit later on about some of the frankly stupid shit that's happening right now with our governments. Yeah. So the process with which regulation happens in the federal agencies is actually going to be a little bit different, quite a bit different actually than the legislative process that goes through Congress. So when a regulatory agency wants to pass a rule, they go through a rulemaking process that basically consists of three parts, okay? They write a rule and then they announce it to the public. And so this is the first stage, and this is what's known as a proposed rulemaking. And so they release the rule so that everyone can have a chance to look at it, and then they open up a time period with which the public can comment, right? And so public comment means literally anyone can look at the rule and write commentary about it. They can make suggestions. They can say, oh, this thing is great. They can have questions for the regulatory agencies. So anyone, any Joe Schmo, you and I, we could all comment into a rule when it's announced. Typically, who are the people who would be responding to a rule? Well, the stakeholders who are going to be affected by the rule. So if I'm making some kind of vehicle regulation, you can bet that like automakers are making comments. You can have like nonprofit organizations, NGOs. You can have researchers at universities making comments. And so we'll dive a little bit more into that later. But that commenting period on average is something like 90 days. So you have something like 3 months. That can vary in length, as we'll see later. It can be longer, it can be shorter, and the regulatory agency makes the determination for how long a comment period is open. Following the comment period, the agency will take all of the comments, and they are legally obligated to respond to all of the comments before they release the final rule, which is the last thing that happens. In the final rule, so actually, before I talk about the final rule, when I say respond to a comment, it doesn't mean that they have to like incorporate a suggested change. They just have to respond to it, and they could say, yes, we read your comment, and that's it, or they could provide a sort of more detailed response. The final rule, when it gets published, that regulation is now a rule that has the same force of law as a legislation. Well, okay, caveat, almost the same force of law. If a legislation and regulation ever conflict, who wins? Legislation, Okay, so legislation will always trump regulation, and the idea being that like uh, legislation is like a more democratic process, I guess. Yeah.
If there's ever a conflict between the two, is that where they end up in court, or?
It can be, yes. It can be. I think the sort of de facto is that legislation can overrule regulation, but regulation cannot overrule legislation. And if things come into conflict, then oftentimes that's grounds for like, yeah, going to court. Yeah.
But the fact that a regulation is usually done by someone that has more knowledge about the field, doesn't that make a difference?
Yeah, so it's very rare that regulation would try to challenge legislation because the idea is that the agency has a mandate from the executive and from the legislature to do certain things. And so the legislature can ask regulatory agencies to like do something, that they may ask them to implement a particular bill and have the regulators figure out the details, or at least that's how it used to work. But regulatory agencies would never see a law and be like, "Oh, that's a bad law. Let me make a regulation that overrides it." That just doesn't really happen because they essentially respect that legislation always has precedence. Now you can have the converse, which is a regulatory agency determines that, oh, we should do this thing, and so they release a rule about it. Congress can be like, we don't like that. We're going to write a law that gets rid of that, and they can do that. Yeah.
So for example, with the endangerment finding, was that?
We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about endangerment a lot later today. Yeah.
That was related.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So this is process, and let's walk through some examples of this so we can get a little bit more familiar. But generally speaking, this is the basics of legislation versus regulation. Yeah. Yep.
Under the finalized when column,
Mhm.
the legislation, it seems like the president can veto it.
Yeah.
Is there no veto mechanism for regulation?
No, not really.
So in general, once it gets to the middle point, it's pretty much a done deal. I mean, if it's not stopped in its tracks.
Yeah. I will say, like, okay, so regulatory agencies fall under what branch of government? Does anyone know? Yes, the executive. So the president can direct the regulatory agencies to do whatever he wants, right? So what I mean is, this doesn't really happen because, so you could have a regulatory agency release a proposed rule, and then the president could be like, no, I don't want you guys to do that. And then they could like withdraw it. I don't think that has happened very often. And usually that doesn't happen because the president may be the one directing them to even start a rulemaking process. So to make a rulemaking process that goes against the president's wishes would be pretty rare. Yeah. A lot of regulation goes kind of in lockstep with the goals of the executive. So either the governor or the president, when they issue like an executive order, for example, like the governor issues an executive order, one that maybe you guys are familiar with, the governor says, by 2035, we're not going to allow anyone to drive a gas car, or we're not going to let gas cars be sold, right? That's part of an executive order. That creates a mandate for regulatory agencies to think about making regulation to do that. And so after Newsom made that executive order dictating no gas cars being sold by 2035, what happens is that CARB then goes and updates ACC2 and the ZEV requirements so that that you have like EVs and ZEVs ramping up to 100% by 2035, right? So there's like there is like regulations often follow the sort of dictates or mandates by the president or by the governor, by the executive.
That makes sense. And forget it.
Okay, cool. And we're going to see how that plays out a little in some of these things. Okay, so as I was mentioning, corporate average fuel efficiency standards, my sort of pet policy that I've worked on for too long now. So this is our sort of policy case study for the day. So back in the 1970s, there was this oil crisis that happened. This was all before any of us were born, including me. I'm not that old. This increases, the particular act passed by Congress was meant to address this oil crisis, and they wanted to do this through 4 primary mechanisms, which is to increase energy production and supply, so trying to get more oil production in the US, reduce energy demand, so get people to drive less, provide energy efficiency, so the technology uses less fuel, and then more like powers to respond to disruptions in energy supply. So that third piece was a requirement for the U.S. Department of Transportation, and specifically within the U.S. DOT, there is an administration called NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to enforce compliance with efficiency standards. Okay? So this is kind of what this has looked like historically. So essentially, we used to have trucks, right, in pink, and then cars in blue and orange. Orange is imported cars, blue is domestically produced cars. They used to have pretty low fuel efficiencies, and there were requirements over the years to essentially get vehicles to be more efficient, right? And so on average, fleets of cars have gotten more efficient over time thanks to these standards. So we're gonna peel back the onion a little bit at a time and think about this policy in a little bit more detail. So CAFE, so it's a common misconception that all cars need to be a certain fuel efficiency, but actually it is a regulation for an automaker's entire fleet. So you can have dirty cars as long as you have really clean cars, or you can have a bunch of like, middling cars, as long as the average across all the cars that you sell reaches a fuel efficiency requirement. Okay, so sales weighted fuel efficiency for every manufacturer needs to reach a specific target. Okay, what's the average fuel economy for a manufacturer that sells 10, 20 MPG cars and 10, 30 MPG cars? What was that? 25? It's a trick question. It's actually not 25. So we don't have a marker. So we do harmonic averages because MPG is like this 1/x nonlinear thing. If you think about fuel consumption, you really should be thinking about gallons per mile. So it's actually 10/20 plus 10/30 equals 20/x, where x is the average. So it ends up being a little bit lower than 25. It's like 24 point something. Does everyone know about the MPG illusion? A couple of people here. Let me, all right, we'll do this really quick. This is probably the best way to think about Of course, I have to reset all of this up. And here we'll switch. Okay. Oh, now it's doing this thing again. No, why won't you work? Okay, I'm not going to be able to do this. All right, we'll do it like this. Okay, so let's say I have car A and car B. Car A is a 40 mpg car, and car B is a 20 mpg car. If I were to increase the mpg, so plus 10 mpg, and here I'm going to change car B from 20 to 25 mpg, so plus 5 mpg. Okay, so car A gets a 10 mpg upgrade, car B gets a 5 mpg upgrade. Which, if your objective was to save more fuel, which of these would you rather do? Car A.
Probably you would go with
Car A? Okay, so this is why this is called the MPG illusion. Let's say I travel 100 miles. How many gallons to travel 100 miles? Okay, so originally 40 mpg, this would take 2.5 gallons, right? 100 divided by 40. And then if I switch to 50 mpg, this would take me 2 gallons. Okay, how many gallons to travel 100 miles? So 20 mpg, how many gallons? 5 gallons. 25 mpg, how many gallons? 4 gallons. So switching plus 10 mpg on car A gets me a savings of half a gallon of gasoline, whereas for car B, I get twice as much. I get 1 full gallon of gasoline. And the reason for this is when you think about consumption, that should be gallons per mile. And then when you do the inverse of that, that ratio is no longer linear. And so that the real kind of takeaway from this is, like, if you are in a really pretty clean car and you switch to like a slightly cleaner car, you know, if you're going from like a Camry hybrid to like a Prius, that is less effective from a fuel savings perspective compared to like getting a dirty car to be slightly cleaner. So improving the fuel efficiency of a dirty truck is going to get you a lot more bang for your buck than improving the fuel efficiency for a car that's like moderately clean already. Make sense? So this is having to do with this harmonic average thing that I was referring to here. Okay, any questions? All right. When an automaker complies with the regulation, with this CAFE regulation, they can generate credits based on their target, and these credits can get traded between automakers. They can also be banked. So what happens if you're just like, oh, I just don't want to comply with these regulations? Well, NHTSA can actually enforce civil penalties equal to $55 per MPG out of compliance per vehicle, right? And so if you are, if you sell 1,000 cars and you are 1 MPG below the target, you will end up paying $55,000 in fines. $55, right, per vehicle. And we can see here, so these are older. This goes out to kind of 2008, and this, the way that companies have complied have maybe changed a little bit since then. But in general, the rule of thumb that I kind of explain to people is that American automakers tend to be right around the average, and so they're kind of like right in compliance. Sometimes they're over, sometimes they're under a little bit, but generally they're going to be right there. A lot of European automakers tend to be under compliant and pay penalties. So think about a lot of this has to do with many European brands focusing on the luxury segment, where they're willing to eat the cost of the penalties because of the sort of product segment that they're trying to capture in like the luxury segment. So think about like Mercedes, BMW, Porsche. These guys are very often the ones paying fines. And then a lot of, again, this is kind of stereotypically, a lot of the Asian automakers tend to be over compliant. So you think about like Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, they tend to make more fuel efficient vehicles, and that's part of their product strategy, right? They are, they try to capture the market segment of the population who tends to favor more fuel efficient vehicles. Okay, if I jump back to here, one of the things that you'll notice is that there's kind of this like long flat period happening in the like 90s and early 2000s. And so what was going on here? During Bush Sr., the CAFE standards were frozen, which meant that the standards weren't actually increasing for a pretty long period of time, almost 20 years. And what you saw in the actual like vehicle attributes is that automakers would be making lots of investments into improving things like horsepower, carrying capacity and that sort of thing, but not so much in fuel efficiency, at least directly, right? A lot of times when you can have trade-offs in like power and efficiency. So inherently fuel efficiency was actually improving, but all of the trade-offs were going into other attributes of the vehicle. So back in the 2000s, there was a state senator, Fran Pavley in California. So she was a senator, a state senator of California. Although actually, I'm actually this is not quite accurate. Back then, she was an assembly member, not a senator. She later became a senator. But back when she authored this particular bill, AB 1493, this was kind of a response to the fact that our fuel efficiency standards weren't improving. And so she wrote this bill to require reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle tailpipes. So we talked about why California has the authority to do something like this in an earlier lecture. Does anyone remember what that comes from? Yeah.
California Air Board, like the resource board, was created for the EPA, and their standards were more strict than EPA's. So
Yep.
that's
Yes, exactly. So as part of the second version of the Clean Air Act in the 1970s, they gave California the ability to do their own regulation as it pertains to air quality, with one caveat, which is, do you remember? Does anyone remember? What does California have to do if they change any of the rules? Yeah.
It has to at least meet the minimum set by TTP.
So yes, but there's that's kind of inherent, baked into the requirements. Yeah. Yes, and that is through a process called a waiver, and so you can request the state of California has to request a waiver from EPA when they implement these new rules. So Fran Pavley authors these rules, and that essentially directs CARB, right? When you have legislation passed, that can direct a regulatory agency to do something. So CARB then decides or is required to implement this thing, but they have to get a waiver from the federal government. So that waiver request was made in 2005. Who is president in 2005? Bush Jr. Do we think that Bush Jr. is going to approve California's waiver request? No. So they delayed it a long time, and then they ended up denying back in 2008. Okay. So we got some side stuff happening in California. Okay, let's take another little sidestep. In 2007, I may have briefly mentioned this court case at some point, right? But this is a Supreme Court case that happened and was ruled in 2007, where Massachusetts was suing the Environmental Protection Agency alongside 11 other states about whether or not EPA has the legal authority to regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. So remember, the Clean Air Act was talking about pollution damages to our population, and so does carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, qualify as a pollutant that EPA should be regulating? And so what ends up happening is that Supreme Court rules in favor of Massachusetts, and that EPA has to regulate carbon dioxide from motor vehicles. Okay, I have a little asterisk there, because that hinges on a requirement that the Supreme Court gave to the EPA, which is known as the endangerment finding. So it says EPA does need to regulate greenhouse gases if you can demonstrate two things. So one, that greenhouse gases endanger health and welfare, and two, that vehicle emissions contribute to greenhouse gas pollution. Yeah, I think in the broader scientific community, neither of these two things is very difficult to establish. And at that time, EPA, through the endangerment finding, demonstrated these 2 points, and therefore are required by the Supreme Court to regulate CO2. Okay, so what happens at the end of 2008? Obama's elected. Yes, and so we get the waiver granted to California almost immediately. So now we have this interesting thing that happens. So CARB now has authority to regulate emissions from cars. US DOT, NHTSA, is already regulating fuel efficiency from cars. And now, because of the Supreme Court case, the federal EPA also has to create regulations on emissions of vehicles. And so, just kind of as an aside, right? Fuel efficiency and emissions rates from vehicles are like essentially the same thing, right? There's a very corresponding relationship between combustion of gasoline and how much you get out of it on a like per mile service basis with the emissions coming out of it when you combust gasoline. So these regulations are going to be inherently sort of tied with one another. So if you are an automaker, your life suddenly becomes very hard, right? Because now you have to contend with 3 different pieces of regulation, and some of it being only geographically located in certain regions, right? So a lot of automakers protest, kind of maybe rightly so, that it's going to be very difficult and costly to have 3 different standards. So EPA and NHTSA end up harmonizing the standards so they basically match to the greatest extent possible. You can't have them perfectly matched because actually certain things fall under certain authorities that have to do with the fuel efficiencies and the emissions rates that the other might not be allowed to. But basically they've been harmonized. And California decides to step back and not pursue their own rules under the PAVLI regulation. But actually, this is a good thing that California was at the table because they could have they could kind of tip the scales to some extent, right? So without CARB at the table, it's unlikely that the CAFE standards and the GHG standards would have been as stringent as they were at the time, because California always had this threat that they could say, if you guys don't make these rules more stringent, we're just going to make our own rules. And that forced EPA and NHTSA to like essentially ramp up the requirements. And so they all came to an agreement, and this formed the basis of what was known at the time as this one national program, which is kind of this idea that the US DOT and EPA would harmonize and that California wouldn't regulate. So this was a big update back then. They set out standards from 2012 out to 2025. At the time, it made the news a lot, where basically vehicles on average would have to be 55 mpg by 2025. Note that that is on a slightly older measurement of fuel efficiency. It's called a 2-cycle test. So it's not actually 55 mpg. The equivalent in the real world would probably be more like 35 to 38 mpg. And so one thing to keep in mind for this historical context is that NHTSA is not allowed to create regulation for that long amount of time, so it's actually split into multiple phases. So there is phase 1, which is 2012 to 2016, and then phase 2, which is 2017 out to 2025. So let's dig a little bit deeper. These policies are based on what's known as a footprint-based standard. Does anyone know what a vehicle footprint is? Yeah.
The size of it, essentially, like underneath the vehicle, like the amount of space it's covering.
Yeah, close. So the formal definition of the footprint is the wheelbase times the track length, which is basically the area of the vehicle under the the rectangle that you would draw if each of the vertices were located on the wheels. So the length of like the axle and then the distance between the wheels. So that correlates to size, although some people will argue that like the footprint is like a better indicator for certain characteristics of the vehicle than the total size. But yes, basically size. And that there's an allowance there basically that if generally speaking, let's say you're an automaker that produces larger cars on average, that means your fuel efficiencies are going to be lower simply by physics, right? And so there's an allowance that that larger vehicles or larger footprint vehicles can have a sort of slightly lower stringency, right? And so if we look at this, these are based on emissions rate. So if you have, so the lines go down over time, which means that, right, on emissions rate basis, you are allowed to emit less and less as the years go on. Okay, so ignore the many lines. If you just focus on any one particular line, the idea is that you have a big vehicle, you're allowed to emit more, and you have a smaller vehicle, you are allowed to emit less. Okay, and then they separated out these into cars and trucks. Any questions about this? This part can get a little confusing sometimes. So there are a lot of implications with the way that the rules were written. So if the instantiation of these footprint-based standards was based on differences in vehicle sizes so as to not favor one manufacturer over another, what incentive might an automaker have as they produce vehicles into the future? Yeah.
Make them bigger so you don't have to improve efficiency.
Yes, exactly. So standards create an incentive to increase vehicle size. There was a nice paper out of, at the time, there's a professor at University of Michigan where they looked at the trade-offs of how hard would it be for an automaker to improve the fuel efficiency versus to just increase the vehicle size, right? And what the costs for doing that of doing that are. And they found that there's a pretty strong incentive for automakers to do this. And lo and behold, if you look at the trends of vehicle sizes over the last like decade and a half, car footprints have gotten a lot bigger. And this paper was published kind of right at the start of those standards, and it played out to be pretty correct. And so this was an equilibrium forecasting model. Uses a lot of the tools that we talked about in this class to create the model. So a nice example of the application to policy. How do the regulatory agencies actually decide on like a particular number? Do they just like pull 55 miles per gallon out of the hat, right? So actually they do a lot of internal modeling in order to understand the capabilities and costs that automakers would incur to improve fuel efficiency and lower emissions rate, as well as kind of understand the optimal route through modeling to inject specific technologies into vehicles to improve fuel efficiency. So they have these two sets of models, so the Omega model on the EPA side and the Volpe model on the DOT side. These are basically models that provide guidance to actually set the standards. A lot of the like cost information come from these interviews and expert elicitations that the agencies have with automakers to understand what like costs of different technologies would look like. After these models had gone out and helped set the standards, there was a national academies convening with a bunch of experts in the field to study some of the cost assumptions, right? And so, you know, these are what are the costs of like mass reduction, different transmission setups, like low friction lubricants, all of these things, all of these possible pathways to improve fuel efficiency. And that ended up giving a whole bunch of feedback to the midterm review of the standards. And so I think this is a nice example where you have like the scientific community coming together to help improve some of the modeling assumptions and characteristics that the agencies were doing. And certainly played a role in the update of the standards that were later proposed for phase 2. Oop, hang on. Let me fix this really quick. Oop. Just needed to move that up. Okay. One of the things that wasn't accounted for is this idea that as you have policies like CAFE and ZEV getting CAFE and GHG implemented, there are other policies that exist that may influence this. So the ZEV policy that we talked about in California that requires electric vehicles, oftentimes when you think about what the Omega and Volpe models were doing, they say, okay, you need to get to this fuel efficiency, here's the cheapest thing to do, and then here's the next cheapest thing to do, and then here's the next cheapest thing to do. When you have ZEV policy, electrification tends to actually be one of the more expensive ways to improve fuel efficiency. And so it forces you to take a different pathway than what those models may have considered optimal. So this was a study that we had done, maybe 9 or 10 years ago, where we essentially remodeled Omega and Volpe and had it interact with the ZEV policy in this like optimization model, and look at what the cost implications of that were. Okay. So remember how I was talking about how the US DOT and EPA decided to harmonize their standards? That's kind of all well and good for a gas car, but that pairing is a lot more difficult when we start thinking about alternative fuels. So what is the efficiency, right? So if we think about a gas car, right? So a Toyota Prius, for example, that has like 55 mpg, and then you can just directly calculate the emissions rate being 160 grams of CO2 per mile. There's a conversion number that you can use is 8,887 grams of CO2 per gallon of gasoline combusted. So you can use that to interchange between efficiency and emissions rate. Okay, if we think about efficiency and emissions rate for an electric car, suddenly it's like not so straightforward, right? So efficiency, okay, now we think about efficiency in terms of like kilowatt hours per mile or miles per kilowatt hour, same thing as MPG. But then on the emission side, it's like, okay, it could be 0 emissions if you want to just measure the tailpipe, or it could be something depending on where you are in the country, what time of the day that you're charging, and what assumptions you're making about the emissions associated with that electricity, right? So suddenly these things are very sort of disconnected. So the question is, even if the US DOT can track this in a pretty simple way, what does EPA do for the emissions side for an EV? What do you guys think? How do they do this? Any guesses?
We make another category for electric, maybe?
Yeah, they could do that, and then how would they calculate the emissions rates though?
Do like average emissions for that interconnect. So I forget how many there are. Is it like 6 or something?
There's three interconnects, yeah. WEC, Eastern, and Texas, ERCOT.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they could do something like that, and actually there have been some proposals to do actually slightly more nuanced than that, but essentially something like that. But actually, what they end up doing is they're like, we don't want to deal with it. It's just going to be zero. So I mean, it's not totally unreasonable in the sense that it is not as though an automaker has control over, right? If the standards are meant to regulate automakers and the vehicles that they produce, it's not as though automakers have control over the electricity generation. So having them be zero is not, I don't think I mean, this is a debated topic, but I don't think it's totally unreasonable if you have like other regulation that's thinking about emissions from like power plants and that sort of thing. Okay, but as part of the Obama era rules, they have incentives for alternative fuel vehicles, which is the AFVs. There's two sets of incentives. They're called weights and they're multipliers. So a weight is a multiplication against the emissions rate for an alternative fuel vehicle. So the weight for electric vehicles is just zero. So it doesn't matter what the emissions end up being because you just multiply by zero. The multipliers are an incentive to help incentivize automakers to produce certain vehicles because they get counted more. So the idea here is that, okay, a BEV has a weight of 1. That means when I sell an electric vehicle, I get to count that as 2 EVs being sold. So when you do the math for the fuel efficiency, you get double the benefit. Okay, and these are just incentives that you can provide so that automakers get a bigger gain from selling these alternative fuel vehicles. There is some issue with this, right? So we think about, actually, I need to update this example because there's, more salient ones at this point. But the current, this should be the GHG standards, right? When you have 0 for everything, you don't actually differentiate. So you lose the signal that the standards are creating to make the vehicles more efficient. So this Hyundai Ioniq and this Jaguar I-Pace, the Jaguar I-Pace uses almost twice as much energy for the same distance. But from the viewpoint of the regulations, they end up being the same. And so that you lose that efficiency signal for electric vehicles, at least on the EPA side. So this is a different example of some systems modeling that I had done. This was like, I think one of the first papers out of my dissertation back in the day, where I was looking at these weights and multipliers that I was just talking about and seeing what implications that had on real world emissions. Okay, and so to walk you through what this looks like, what's actually happening here. So this black line is our standard, right? So this is you as an automaker, you're allowed to sell vehicles that on average emit this amount of carbon dioxide, and over time that goes down, okay? So if I sold a really clean vehicle, that actually lets me also sell a really dirty vehicle on top of that, because they balance and average out. And this is what automakers strategically like to do, right? Is your fuel efficient vehicles, you sell those to help get you to the standard, and then you sell, let's call them dirtier vehicles, which tend to have higher profit margins. So things like, you know, a larger, you know, crossover or SUV or truck or minivan or something like that. You balance those out against your clean vehicles. Okay, but because of the weights and multipliers that I was mentioning, a clean vehicle, like an electric vehicle, would end up actually looking more like this in the standards, even though this is what it would look like in reality, which means in the standards you get to inflate and sell an even dirtier car. And so this difference is an artificial increase in emissions thanks to the weights and multipliers. And so we kind of help quantify that, that increase and what that would mean to the standards. And it ends up decreasing the stringency of your standards by a couple percent. Any questions? Okay, let's take a quick, let's say 4-minute break, and then we'll jump back into our historical context on some of this policy. Yes.
How did people react to this paper? Or like the average reaction to?
As I recall, a lot of people in this like area kind of had some intuition that this was happening, but they weren't sure to what extent it was, and so a lot of people were like, oh yeah, like it makes sense because it kind of follows with what they were thinking, but yeah, they were like, oh, it's nice to see what the actual numbers were. I think some of the regulators were like, yeah, we were just trying to keep this on the down low. This may paint it as kind of a bad thing. This is more of like quantifying the effect. I think there's an understanding that there is this trade-off when you structure the incentives this way. And they were like, a lot of the regulators were like, we were kind of willing to make that trade-off to help promote, you know, EVs and that sort of thing.
Do you think, I have the impression that over the years, like the way new technology comes out is way too fast to like keep up with regulating these things. Do you think that, like if you do make like an adjustment that addresses this issue, that
Uh-huh.
it would be kind
Well, in some cases, you have stuff like that happening, but I think in a lot of these regulatory examples, it's the regulations that are really pushing the market rather than the other way around. Like I can tell you with, I would put a lot of money on the EV technology being not where it is today without like the California regulation. Yeah, like Tesla probably would not have survived without California regulation. Yeah.
Professor Jen.
Yes.
Go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
Okay, maybe not that one, the one before that, I guess.
This one.
Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles have a weight factor too.
Yes. For the portion of their operation that's on electricity, which is determined by this number here. Yeah. Okay. So I've been kind of talking about a number of these little case studies and research that had happened in this area that really started in the like 2010, 2012 time period, right? And so there wasn't that much happening in cafe, for the 20 years prior, as I was mentioning, the standards were frozen. And when the Obama era rules came out, I think that was a, let's say, exciting time for some of us, and there was like kind of a bloom of research that happened, and it was good. There was a sort of injection of a lot of like scientific perspective into the new rules that were happening, so it gave us a better understanding of impacts and like unintended consequences, like this thing. And remember what I was saying, that the rules follow two general phases, right? So phase one from 2012 to 2016, and then the update from 2017 to 2025, that phase two. So you have all of this scientific research happening and potentially helping influence in the sort of midterm review process. So 2017, there is a scheduled midterm review to update the latter half of that 2025 piece. So there's this midterm review that's scheduled to happen in 2017. Okay, so remember what I was saying at the beginning of class. What are the three things that happen for a regulation to pass? It is proposed rule, open comment period, then final rule. So what happens at the end of 2016? Trump gets elected. We suspect that, at the time, a lot of folks suspected that these rules would probably get watered down a lot during the Trump administration. So instead of waiting till 2017, the EPA and Obama administration announced the proposed rule in December, like 1 month before the transition. How long did you say a public comment period usually takes? Yeah, about 3 months on average. So after the proposed rule, EPA said, you guys have 1 week to make public comments. And so I remember at the time, people were like scrambling. All these automakers were like figuring out what comments they wanted to submit with the new rules. And so all these comments like pour in during this 1 week. And then a couple days after the comment period closes, they said, we looked at all your comments, and we decided to not change anything in the final rule. And so they just released that final rule. This was a preemptive supplementary method. So this was like I later came to understand this is kind of a legal strategy that the EPA, that the Obama administration EPA was taking, because some nuances about regulation. If you are doing it in a transition time period after an election, the next president can overturn it without going through a new process. So they knew this was going to get overturned, but one of the things that happens is that if you make a new rule after this, all of this is allowed to be introduced as like evidence in a legal battle. So this was basically them strategically getting ready to have all of the material associated with their rule introduced in court. Okay, so what ends up happening? So the Trump administration ends up passing a watered down version of the CAFE standards. So this is known as the SAFE rule. They changed a lot of the assumptions and some of the modeling. Some pretty kind of outrageous assumptions. There was a famous paper published by a bunch of prominent economists that looked at their analysis and basically saying that the analysis was done pretty terribly. They had crazy assumptions about safety issues. They took out benefits related to greenhouse gas emission damages reductions. And so the original proposed rule for SAFE was to actually freeze the standard, so you have like no improvements in fuel efficiency at all. And the rule that ended up getting passed was like a 1.5% increase in fuel efficiency per year. And to give some context, I have this in our. This is a kind of a separate slide that I'd made in a different presentation that I stuck in here as a summary. So in the Obama era, essentially the trend was about a 5% increase in fuel efficiency a year. With the Trump rules, you had about a 1.5% increase every year, so down from 5%. There was a whole slew of things that happened in kind of the Trump era. Remember, I was talking about earlier about how California originally backed out of doing their own fuel efficiency standards in order to have this harmonized thing. During the Trump era, they threatened basically that, since you're doing this to the rules, we're going to make our own rules, and there was a whole conflict with the waiver and all of that. And in the Biden administration, they ended up overturning the rule very quickly and implementing an even more sort of aggressive fuel efficiency requirement of 8% per year, up from this 1.5%. So one of the things that I'll mention is that as much as it is difficult for an automaker to comply with any one of these regulations, the thing that they hate more than any of this is like these quick turnaround changes in the regulation. So the time that it takes an automaker to update like a vehicle model is about 5 to 6 years. And so if you imagine that a rule comes into place and I start making plans on a 5 to 6 year basis, and then in 4 years that changes, then all of the costs that I've sunk into trying to do to meet a particular target kind of gets wasted, right? So there is this balance between allowing regulation to have flexibility to update based on changes in the industry and updates based on where we see the technology going and that sort of thing, but also kind of being resilient to these sort of political turnovers that are happening every 4 years. Automakers really would prefer to have certainty, even if you have a more aggressive sort of policy. Yeah, this is a kind of viewpoint of how things have kind of changed over time. This is updated to the recent Biden rule changes, but maybe I haven't updated this to the most recent set of changes, which we'll talk about in just a second. So this is the equating of the grams of CO2 per mile to MPG. You'll notice the MPG is nonlinear because of that 1 over x thing that I was mentioning before. Okay. Yeah, so back in 2023, in the Biden administration, they announced rulemakings for both new standards on the greenhouse gas emissions side and on the CAFE standards going out to 2032. And both of those ended up going through the full process and releasing a final rule in late 2023 and early 2024. One of the interesting things, so this is directly from the regulation proposal. This line indicates the sort of decrease in emissions in the GHG standards over time and what the requirement would look like. So by 2032, you have to hit 82 grams of CO2 per mile. What is the most fuel efficient car on the market right now? Gas car. Prius. Exactly. Does anyone know what the fuel efficiency of a Prius is?
50?
Yeah, a little higher, like 50, 55 mpg. And so you can translate that into greenhouse gas emissions, and you would get about 155 grams of CO2 per mile. Okay. So if every single car on the road was a Prius, would we be able to comply with the new regulations? No. So you can't actually meet the new requirements without having electric vehicles. This is actually a kind of departure from the way that the regulations had traditionally been structured. This is much more in line with like what the EU is doing, where they're using these efficiency standards to push alternative fuel vehicle technologies. And that's kind of the first time this had been done kind of at the federal level. This is basically a requirement to have lots of electric vehicles. Yes.
But for EVs, we can actually calculate the CO2 emissions very accurately, right?
Yes. Well, they consider them to just be zero. Yeah. Zero tailpipe. They do start to depart a little bit. So remember, I was talking about harmonization between EPA and DOT. If I look at what's proposed on the greenhouse gas emission side and versus what's proposed on the fuel efficiency side, and you kind of line them up, there would be some departure of this. Yeah, and I guess we're really getting into the kind of nuts and bolts of it here, but that has to do with what we assume about the way we calculate efficiency for EVs in the CAFE rules. So on the greenhouse gas emission side, it's just zero, but on the CAFE side of things, there's a way where you translate into a miles per gallon equivalent. So there's a fundamental question of how you actually do this, right? So EPA counts them as 0 grams of CO2 per mile. NHTSA uses what's known as a petroleum equivalency factor, which is basically some method that I can convert EV efficiency into the equivalent petroleum efficiency. And so a couple years ago, the DOE released some regulation guidance on how to update this number. It used to be the petroleum equivalency factor was 80,000 watt hours per gallon, which is literally the full energy content of the electricity turned into the fuel content of gasoline. And the new approach takes into account like losses from upstream conversion. So just to give some sense of what that translation looks like, in the old way that we did it prior to like 2022, 2023, like an ID4 would get 380 miles per gallon. A Ford F-150 Lightning would get 240 miles per gallon. Pacifica would get 90 miles per gallon. And now with this update, you would get 100 miles per gallon ID4, 67 miles per gallon Ford Lightning, and then 60 mpg for like a Chrysler Pacifica. Okay. Oh, hang on. I need to make a quick adjustment. All right. Okay. So how are these different? Let's take an example. So in 2032, if your target is 70 grams per mile, from EPA's perspective, you have 5 gas cars that are driving at 140 grams per mile, and you have 5 electric vehicles driving at 0 grams per mile, right? Because they count emissions from EVs at 0. So your average is 70 grams per mile, which is the equivalent of 127 mpg. From NHTSA's perspective, you have a fuel efficiency of 63.5 mpg for gas cars. That's what 140 grams would be. And then instead of 0 grams per mile, we have the actual electric efficiency. And then if we use our petroleum equivalency factor calculations, you know, the old one might be 260 plus mpg, and the new version would be 77 mpg. And so the average would end up being 70.4 mpg, which would equate to 126 grams per mile, right? So literally, you're using the same vehicles, but the accounting will make them look really different. And so, yeah, the devil's kind of really in the details of how you integrate and what that means for determining the standards. I'm going to maybe brush through a couple of these slides really quickly. So there's a couple slides that I included here that are part of the proposed rules. You have to do these regulatory impact assessments where they measure what the impacts are going to be. And so what will the mix of technologies look like into the future? They had done a bunch of modeling there, and they had calculated a bunch of the sort of emission savings and impacts as a result of having a lot more of these like electric vehicles due to the stringency of the standard. Yeah, and so I'll kind of leave that for context. They also have to do economic assessments, and so here they calculate different savings across different categories like emissions, benefits, climate benefits. They look at non-emission costs. So what happens to like congestion and noise? They have like fuel savings costs from improving fuel efficiency and switching to electricity and that sort of thing. They measure all of this stuff out. Yeah, so I'm not going to go through all of that because now we're back to Trump 2.0. Where are we today? So, on the EPA side of things, GHG standards, in July of last year, there was a proposed rule to essentially get rid of the greenhouse gas emission standards completely on the EPA side. And a part of the proposed rule was rescinding of the endangerment finding. Okay, so that Supreme Court case and the implications of what came out of that, they're basically saying we're gonna get rid of that. And that was finalized last month, just actually a couple weeks ago. Right now, we're actually in the process of finalizing the rule for the update to corporate fuel efficiency standards. So on July 4th last year, if you guys remember, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And as part of that, the fines for not complying with CAFE were eliminated. So even if you totally undercomplied, it wouldn't really matter because you didn't have to pay a penalty. It's not great, but it's probably not quite as bad as most people think. A lot of companies will still try and comply with the regulation to avoid legal issues, even if they're not getting fined. So some companies will follow CAFE standards even in the absence of the fines, which I guess is a good thing. And then they had a proposed rule update on December of last year, and the commenting period for that set of rules closed in February. So we had submitted a whole bunch of stuff to both of these. We had submitted comments to both of these. And I'm happy to talk about all the screwy, crazy stuff that they did in here if folks are interested. But the one thing, the kind of one big thing that I wanted to go over. So remember, we talked about the endangerment finding. The two things that are necessary are that greenhouse gases endanger health and welfare, and that vehicle emissions will contribute to greenhouse gases, right? If you follow those things, then according to the Supreme Court, you are required to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So what arguments was the EPA making in their proposed rules? So there was kind of 4 central arguments. And maybe we can discuss and see what you guys think about these arguments. So 1, EPA exceeds its authority, and that via the Clean Air Act, it's only supposed to be regulating local air pollutants. What do you guys think about that? Yeah.
It's not completely wrong. I think if you add CO2 to the list of pollutants, then we wouldn't be having that argument.
Okay. Well, I mean, the original Clean Air Act is pretty specific on the pollutants that are required.
I think they might say it exceeded their authority because they
Yeah.
don't regulate vehicles, they regulate other things. So it would be like overstepping into US DOT territory in a way.
Well, DOT doesn't regulate emissions, right? That's all up to EPA. So it's not actually that. It's more that first argument that it's not like greenhouse gases aren't included in the pollutants that were listed in the Clean Air Act. But wasn't there some Supreme Court cases that said that yes, you should be? So this flies directly in the face of the 2009 Supreme Court ruling, and there's a Ninth Circuit ruling that happened a couple years after that upheld that, and said that gave EPA this authority. So basically, they're like completely disregarding two precedent court orders. It's kind of ridiculous. Yeah. Second argument is about major questions doctrine. So if there are things that have substantial impacts to like the economy and society, the argument is that agencies can't assert what's known as this like sweeping authority without Congress. Congress has to approve of this. Yeah, and this ties into, have you guys heard of the Chevron doctrine? So this was a different Supreme Court case that happened last year that has to do with major questions doctrine. The Supreme Court basically ruled that yes, agencies need to agencies either need to get authority from Congress to do anything, or it has to be like legally interpreted through the judicial system, which is like bonkers, right? So this is the question we were talking about at the beginning of class. Like, why do we have regulatory agencies? Because they know stuff about topics that that our legislatures don't have expertise in, and for some reason the courts think that judges could now be able to have that expertise. Yeah, big stretch in my view. The third argument is that it's a marginal impact. So even if we were to get rid of all U.S. vehicle emissions, it would constitute only a small share of total emissions, and therefore the reduction in endangerment is negligible. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to even say anything about that. And then the fourth argument is that the EPA relied on expert assessments instead of their own assessments, that they trusted a bunch of climate scientists rather than their own analysis, and that they failed to show causality between vehicle emissions and endangerment, even though literally the endangerment finding does not require you to have causality, right? It's just these, as long as you prove these two things. Yeah, so very frustrating stuff. And then, the science kind of continues to happen. There's already work that's being done to show kind of some of the impacts of changes in these major policies to things like so how this would affect like EV sales, how this would affect CO2 emissions over time. There's a different, so this was a set of papers out of Harvard. This was some modeling done out of some large scale systems models out of Princeton, where they looked at the effect of getting rid of the CAFE penalties, and the broader effects of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and what that would do to emissions, or our future emissions trajectories. And so that's kind of where we're at today. Any questions about any of this? Yes.
Assuming the next government changes over to somebody that cares about us.
Yes.
What's the, I guess, legal ability to reinstitute all the loss protections?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to say. Ostensibly, we could just go through another rulemaking process and swing the other way. I think there are bigger things happening. Well, I mean, yeah, even if you were to do something like that, um, some of the legal precedents that's getting set up by rulings from the court systems are screwing with the regulatory agency's abilities to do some of these things. But a lot of that is like playing out in court these days, so it's hard to say. Yeah. And there's all sorts of like legal strategies of like as this stuff gets challenged. Yeah, certain lawsuits they're trying to keep it out of the Supreme Court and keep it, within certain circuits which are more favorable for some of this stuff. Some of them are trying to delay these lawsuits till the next administration. So there's a lot of interesting things happening in the sort of judicial side right now. Yeah, remains to be seen. It's all very depressing stuff, unfortunately. Yeah, so I have some I have some older slides that looked at some of the modeling stuff that happened in following the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a Biden era legislation that promoted a lot of like clean energy technology and transition stuff. Yeah, I haven't actually updated these since last year, and most of this stuff got overturned. So I don't know how much it's worth talking about. But yeah, the sort of bigger takeaway, in the context of this class, is that in the context of a lot of these like policy and legislative changes and bills that promote these things, it is important to think about the like systems modelings that we talk about as a way to understand kind of these impacts. And so there's a bunch of examples of folks who had started to do a bunch of modeling, really cool, like state-of-the-art modeling to look at things like emissions and cost implications, what would happen to specific like energy sectors, what would happen in terms of like workforce developments. Yeah, some like yeah, so there are a lot of like these younger professors who are like really into these systems modelings and very actively engaging both the public but also kind of the legislature to help inform impact, but also to help shape some of like the future policies, which is really cool, right? This is like a tying of like the skill sets that we're trying to teach in this class to like measurable real world outcomes. But yeah, all of this stuff is gone now, unfortunately. So, but the stuff that we're doing, it's not useless. This continues to be informative for future, hopefully more saner political bodies. So I would urge you guys to all keep it up if you can. Yeah, and the last thing, if you guys don't mind, course evaluations, fill these out if you have a chance. I think they open up on Friday, so I'll send another reminder out to everyone. But yeah, this helps to shape the class and yeah, improve the class. I've altered the content of this class a lot based on suggestions from like previous students, and so I would appreciate If you guys could, yeah, keep that torch going, make suggestions, things you'd like to see, things that you thought, yeah, were not as interesting, just let me know. I would appreciate it. Yeah, and this is our final lecture for the class. Remember, next week we'll start final presentations. I will post the order again on Canvas, but this is our randomly chosen order. You guys are welcome to switch if with other groups if you want. Just let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thanks.